thank you for inviting me, and such a wonderful Congress. As Alex has said, many of you no doubt are familiar with the HeLa story. Perhaps they're reading Rebecca Skloot's bestseller, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which, there we go. I should have put the Spanish cover of the book. The book has been translated into 14 languages, of course Spanish, but 13 others. But perhaps you also know about the HeLa controversy because of something more recent, which was the controversy surrounding the whole genome sequencing of HeLa. What has happened and is continuing to happen to the Lacks family has helped reignite global debates in the ethics of biosample science and genomics about consent and compensation, disclosure, and privacy. As important as these issues are, today I want to argue that they are impossible to resolve independent of considerations of social justice. My comments are in two parts. I'll begin by briefly summarizing what happened to Mrs. Lacks, her children, and her cells, followed by an even briefer review of the ethics and science questions that are embedded in their story. In the second part of my talk, I hope I can show you that these questions are not independent of these wider considerations of social justice. I need to start with a disclaimer. As Alex has already mentioned, I am on the faculty at Johns Hopkins, which is the institution where so much of the science part of this story took place. Also, I was one of two Hopkins leaders who met recently with the Lacks family and the top leadership of our National Institutes of Health about the genome sequencing of the HeLa cell line. Meetings that led to a historic agreement between the Lacks family and the National Institutes of Health, and the formation of the HeLa Genome Data Access Working Group, it's a long title, on which members of the family and I sit. So that's the disclaimer, you ought to know this. All right, so let's begin with part one, which is the story. And here you see a photograph of Mrs. Lacks. It's the kind of iconic photograph of her that is seen everywhere. And her husband, David Lacks, holding the photograph. These photographs were from the early one of Mrs. Lacks is from 1945. And these photographs I show with the permission of the family. So, the story. In 1950, Henrietta Lacks was a poor African-American woman who had recently moved with her family to Baltimore from the South in what has been called the second great Black urban migration from the rural South to cities to seek jobs after World War II. At the time, Mrs. Lacks was a young mother of 5 with little formal education. She was becoming progressively more ill with pain in her lower abdomen, and eventually she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital for treatment. It's very important to know that in 1951, in the early 1950s, Hopkins was the only hospital in the region providing medical care to African Americans. Unusual among American hospitals, it had been founded in 1876 by a bequest from Johns Hopkins, a local philanthropist, who in his will specified, and here I quote, that the hospital would provide care to the indigent sick of this city and its environs without regard to sex, age, or color. Now, despite this requirement in the will, which was honored, Baltimore was nevertheless a southern city. Medical care, while provided to all, was delivered in segregated facilities. Mrs. Lacks was diagnosed with cervical cancer in January of 1951. This was precisely during the time that Dr. George Guy, a Hopkins faculty member, was on a quest to accomplish what had never been done previously, to grow a human cell line, that would be immortal so that it could serve as a standardized research tool. Dr. Guy was asking for tissue samples from any patient in the hospital, particularly patients diagnosed with cancer. On February 8th, during Mrs. Lax's first radiation treatment, which was the standard of care for cervical cancer at that time, a sample of her tumor and of healthy cervical tissue was removed and made available to Dr. Guy and to another research physician. By late February 1951, within weeks of Mrs. Lax's first treatment, the cells isolated from her tissue sample were growing without end. Dr. Guy had achieved his goal of creating an immortal human cell line. These cells, now universally known as HeLa cells, became an essential tool of biological research. Almost immediately, they played an important role in the development of the polio vaccine, one of the most important, of course, developments in the 20th century in public health. Over the years, they have contributed to many medical breakthroughs, including the HPV vaccine, which protects against cervical cancer, the disease that took Mrs. Lax's life. All totaled, over 74,000 international scientific publications have used or mentioned her cells. 74,000. In keeping with the practice of the time, Mrs. Lax's consent for the removal of the tissue sample and for its use in research was never obtained. In October of 1951, Mrs. Lax died in Johns Hopkins Hospital, never knowing of the extraordinary breakthrough in Dr. Guy's lab in that same institution. Her husband and her children did not learn of the existence of HeLa cells or that the cells were being bought, sold, and used in research until 20 years later. For many years, the identity of the source of HeLa was unknown or misrepresented as Helen Lane rather than Henrietta Lacks. When Henrietta Lax's identity was made public, initially in 1971, this was without her family's authorization. Indeed, they were never even notified about their wife's and mother's role in the science, let alone that her name was about to be released to the world. It's also important to know that Dr. Guy and Johns Hopkins did not profit in a direct financial way from this discovery. Again, in keeping with the time, Dr. Guy literally gave HeLa cells away for free to scientists and laboratories all over the world. Now, Guy and Hopkins did profit in other ways, of course, most notably in terms of professional standing. And HeLa cells did go on to make a great deal of money for some in the biomedical industry. Mrs. Lax's family never received any financial compensation. Her children grew up in poverty. Much of the public conversation stimulated by the HeLa cell story has focused on how we ought to think about biosamples and on the science these samples can enable. These are familiar issues to many of us, to many of you. Should patient consent be required for research? Does it matter if the biosamples are removed for clinical purposes or taken solely for research purposes? What kind of consent? Specific and traditional consent or broad and general consent? As genomics and big data science advance, what kind of assurances, if any, can be made about privacy or confidentiality? Is the consent of the source sufficient? What about family members in the case of genomics research? And what about compensation if a blockbuster drug or research tool is developed? Now, these are fascinating, important questions about the ethics of science. However, they are questions that cannot be properly answered as long as we think of them as only or even primarily questions about the ethics of science. They are about science, but they are also about how science engages society more broadly, including centrally questions of social justice. And this takes me to the second part of my talk. Okay. I really hope some of you in the audience know who this woman is. This is Tina Turner, one of my idols. I've titled this part of the talk, What Social Justice Got to Do with It? Perhaps the best way I can bring the social justice theme into this picture is through the voice of Mrs. Lax's daughter, Deborah, as relayed by the author Rebecca Skloot. And here I am quoting. "But I always have thought it was strange, if our mother Cell's done so much for medicine, how come her family can't afford to see no doctors? Don't make no sense. People got rich off my mother without us even knowing about them taking her cells, and now we don't get a dime. I used to get so mad about that to where it made me sick and I had to take pills, but I don't got it in me no more to fight. I just want to know who my mother was." I now want you to consider, in the light of Deborah's statement, two counterfactuals. The first is this. What if Mrs. Lax's family had received financial compensation from the commercialization of her cells? Would their story still be morally troubling, and why? And the second counterfactual is this. What if the details of the story were exactly as Rebecca Skloot relates them, no consent and no compensation, but Mrs. Lax had been an affluent white person whose family was socially prominent? Would their story still be morally troubling, and why? To answer these questions, I need first to explain to you a little bit about how I think about justice, and therefore how a social justice lens can help alter how we think about ethics and science. Here I am working with one particular theory of justice that my colleague Madison Powers and I first presented in 2006. We have been actively refining and expanding what has come to be called the twin aim theory ever since. Our theory is focused on two things: the realization of multiple dimensions of human well-being and the identification of the main impediments to that goal. Justice, in our view, thus has two distinctive and mutually reinforcing aims, hence the twin aim theory. The first aim, or the basic well-being aim, requires that social arrangements secure, insofar as possible, 6 core elements of human well-being, characteristic of a decent human life. What are the core elements of a decent life? These are the things every one of us wants and every one of us needs, no matter who we are. The first is personal security from actual physical and psychological harm, as well as the threat of such harm. The second element is cognition, having an understanding of and engaging deliberately with the natural and social world. The third element is personal attachments, to love and to care for those that we love, both family and friends. The fourth is health. The fifth element is the respect of others, to have the social and political standing that allows a person to be judged and treated as a moral equal, a person worthy of the same sort of treatment any other person merits. The sixth is self-determination, living a life that is not under the domination and control of others or the tyranny of profound necessity, where an individual can shape the broad contours of her life and have some significant say over its general course. The second aim, or the structural fairness aim, requires social arrangements to combat serious forms of disadvantage that are unjust because they are unfair. While the first aim focuses on the injustice of failures to realize the core elements of well-being that are characteristic of a decent life, the second aim focuses on the injustice of creating and maintaining serious social impediments to experiencing adequate levels of well-being. Such impediments are generally multiple and mutually reinforcing, and they systematically favor some at the very great expense of others. Included within the purview of the structural fairness aim are invidious and discriminatory social status norms and practices, as well as the endorsement or toleration of oppressive religious and cultural practices. And finally, there is the special case of childhood, where the failure to secure in childhood sufficient levels of well-being frequently result in deprivation at this critical stage in human development in ways that profoundly disadvantage a person over the course of a lifetime, making later gains impossible. I'm now going to have to rush through the rest of my talk. And I want to connect this with justice. So I want to connect the story now back to justice, so understood, and let's return to the counterfactuals. So what if Mrs. Lax's family had received financial compensation? Well, of course, with any luck, money would have made a significant difference in the well-being of Mrs. Lax's family. The money would have come, however, well past the children's early childhood. It would have done little to mitigate or narrow the more systematic, egregious injustices that the Lax children experienced by virtue of being poor and black in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. And it's for this reason, I submit to you, these reasons, that the HeLa cell story has become so powerful. What is wrong about what happened to the Lax family engages every core element of human well-being on our list. Assaults on respect, on self-determination, on cognition, attachment, personal security, and health. Mrs. Lax and her children were poor black people in a segregated world in which the most profound injustices of racial oppression were daily features of their lives. The children suffered regular hunger and regular abuse when they were little without any interference from the state, any kind of child protective services. Moreover, well into the 1970s, there were continued instances in which the Lax family were not treated respectfully as moral equals, for example, when they were asked for and provided blood samples without understanding that their samples, too, were being used to advance science. So now let's consider the second counterfactual. We'll try to get up. There we go. What if Mrs. Lax had been affluent and white and her family was socially prominent? Would their story still have raised moral concerns? Well, here the answer depends on whether we think a socially prominent white family would have been treated like the Lax family was treated. And here I want to give you another quick quote from Babette Lax, who is Mrs. Lax's daughter-in-law, her eldest son's wife. What really would upset Henrietta is the fact that Dr. Guy never told the family anything. We didn't know anything about those cells, and he didn't care. That just rubbed us the wrong way. I just kept asking everybody, why didn't they say anything to the family? They knew how to contact us. The publication of Rebecca Skloot's book, and more recently the whole genome sequencing of HeLa, has generated an enormous discussion about research, how it should be conducted going forward, what kinds of consent, from whom, compensation, and so on. From the standpoint of the twin aim theory of justice, however, there are other key questions that should be asked as we vet alternative public policies and that necessarily inform how consent and compensation challenges should be addressed. I'm going to take about 1 minute here. It is critical, for example, that we consider the impact of any policy that is being considered on existing unjust inequalities, not only unjust inequalities in material goods and resources, but also inequalities in social and political standing fueled by existing patterns of systematic disadvantage. Whatever policies we adopt for consent, for maintenance of samples, and for disclosure will affect people differently depending on who they are. It is also important to think about the wider web of related social institutions in which any policy would necessarily be embedded and ask, is that wider web of related social institutions, in this case focally the institutions that affect health and healthcare, just to all affected? It is likely that Mrs. Lax's family, and here I conclude, and Mrs. Lax's friends, her community, did not benefit from some of the very scientific advances made possible by HeLa cells, it is a certainty that they did not experience the security of knowing, in the event of illness, that they would be able to access these advances for themselves and their loved ones. As with so many, there was no guarantee their lives would benefit from the science made possible by access to human tissues. For us, more than anything, the Lax family story must be about the inextricable relationship between the ethics of science policy, how we should govern biobanks, genomic research, electronic health records, and so on, and the ethics of health systems and the other social foundations of human well-being. It is about how the least of us live and about social justice. Thank you.